Hi, everyone. Hope you can understand me perfect. I know you're super excited for networking and drinks after. Bear with me 30 more minutes and learn something just as exciting as some drinks. We're talking about some newest additions to Microsoft services, and in particular about APIs. So let me introduce our latest service addition, Azure API Center, to our API platform offerings here at Microsoft. Let me take a step back. Probably Azure API Center is something new, probably most of you haven't heard of it yet. So let me take a step back and really explain what it is, and in particular, what's the difference between Azure API Center and also Azure API Management. So my goal for this session is, first of all, for you to understand the difference, touch on use cases for Azure API Center, and then release you to some drinks and some networking. We've heard about Azure API Management already. Hopefully, most of you have maybe even tested it or using it. So API Management, we have API Management here, our big sister team. It's a gateway solution. It's there for API governance from a runtime perspective. So you can apply policies. This is where Azure API Management is. API Center on the other side is we're an inventory solution. So imagine you're a company that not just has one API management instance, maybe you have multiple different API management instances up and running, maybe even cross cloud. We do understand customers are using this not just within Azure, even though we like, but you're probably using some other services here as well. So you now have APIs all over the place. So you need this one place, this one inventory, where you can register and get better transparency into your APIs. So this is where Azure API Center comes in. We are an inventory solution for better API discovery, API transparency, and also API governance, but very importantly, API design governance. So we talked about API management governance from a runtime perspective, API Center from an API design governance standpoint. So whenever I talk about Azure API Center, I already touched on a few of the themes. So we have 3 themes that come with Azure API Center. First of all, the inventory solution. We talked about APIs being everywhere, and organizations are struggling to really get better transparency into their API ecosystem. So they need this one single place where they can find and see all of these APIs out there. Then the second layer is API governance from a design governance perspective. Imagine you have this inventory, now you have every API in there. Most likely, organizations have certain rules, they have certain guidelines, how these APIs should look like from a compliance, from a security perspective. So again, this is where API Center comes in. Your single hub for all of the APIs that not just checks from an inventory, but also checks on a governance solution. And then last but not least, our last layer, API discovery. Now you have all of your APIs in one place. Your API platform team is very happy. They can check on your inventory itself. They can check on API design governance. Now you want to expose it. You want to make all of your internal developers see and find these APIs and figure out what are these APIs even about. So this is also where API Center comes in. Currently, we support a self-hosted API Center portal, but we also support developer tools like Visual Studio Code. So you can actually go and find these APIs as a developer right within your IDE you already are. I'm more of a demo kind of person, so rather than me talking about a bunch of different slides here, let's jump into the demo and really see what Azure API Center is all about. Let's see, duplicate. Hopefully should out shop. Perfect. Keep changes. That did the trick. Thank you. All right. So now I'm going to have my head on as an API developer, because our product is not just about API admins, it's also about API developers. So right now I have my API developer hat on. I'm in Visual Studio Code. I'm building out an ASP.NET web API. So I implemented a few different controllers. Everyone should probably know the weather forecast APIs. I wanted to mix it up a little bit, so I implemented another controller. Also, by implementing it and building out my API development pipeline, I auto-generated an open API specification. So let's see if I'm not just lying here, and let's just run it real quick locally so we can see and explore some of the endpoints I have here. So I'm opening this. This should look very familiar. Swagger UI, we can explore, we can see the different endpoints. I can even go in here and I can try it out, which is great. Some of the things I want to point out here is in my open API specification, I specified a contact detail, which is going to be important later on. And I also implemented, because I imagine I'm already a step further, I already deployed my API to Azure. So I also implemented a server here. All right, so let me shut this down. All right, so where does Azure API Center come in now? I'm in Visual Studio Code, right? We have a Visual Studio Code extension. So I'm in Visual Studio Code. I want to know what are all of the other APIs that some of my fellow friends also implemented. So as you can see here, I have my API Center up and running, and this is what it currently looks like. So I can find out about all of the different APIs. So now I want to also register the API that I currently build out for other developers to find and see. And there are different ways how to do this. So you can either register it right here within Visual Studio, so you can manually register it. We love CI/CD, so there's also a way to support CI/CD pipelines. I'm going to show you a different way just because I'm already in Visual Studio Code here. So I'm going to use our Azure CLI extension. And just with one command, I'm registering my API here. And what this does, it creates my API. It detects a version, it uploads or creates a definition, and it also uploads my API specification. So now as soon as I hit refresh here, this web API will show up. And now I can do a bunch of fun things here within Visual Studio Code. So currently we support 4 different actions. So one is just exporting the API specification if somebody wants to check it out and wants to see the open API specification here. Today we heard about generating an API client. So that's another option that we are supporting. Imagine you found the right API that you want to now interact with, you want to use in a different project. So that's where we are leveraging Kyoda for generating your API client. So you now as a developer, you found this, you can easily integrate it into your other projects. But we are not quite there yet. We're not quite at the consumption piece. We're still in the exploring. I want to test, I want to see my API. So there we have 2 action items. One is open API documentation. This will open up Swagger UI. It's rendered within Visual Studio. So this should look very familiar what I saw previously while running it locally. We also support generating an HTTP file, which depending on whatever you like, whatever experience you're more familiar with, this is what the HTTP file will look like. Because I defined server URL, it's already showing up here. So now I can go in here, I can hit my send request button, it will open up and it will show me my response and my body. So perfect, I can now explore and figure out more what this API does, what this endpoint looks like. All right, I'm laying down my head as the API developer. What's the API admin experience, right? Like I registered it here. What does the API admin now do? So let's switch to API Center in the Azure portal. So let me hit the refresh button here. Perfect. Web API build is showing up. API admins are usually very busy. Like they don't always know when is a new API coming in. They are not checking the Azure portal every day. And also because we are at the Integrate conference, I thought it would be very interesting to implement a workflow that actually notifies me about, oh, hey, a new API has been registered, which looking at a lot of the customer use cases, approval flows or any kind of workflows is usually something that they are using within our products here as well. So I used our events integration here for implementing a logic app workflow And what this Logic App workflow does is it sends out a Teams message that says, hey, API admin team, a new API has been registered. So my trigger is every time a new API has been registered, it sends out this workflow. It could be an approval workflow. It could be whatever workflow you need within your organization. So I also attended a link, so I don't always have to know the link that I want to go to. I also implemented a few action points here. Before I'm going to hit anything, me as an API admin, let's first check out and explore this API, right? We talked about API governance, for example. So in API Center, we have a concept of metadata. Custom metadata is essentially additional information that you can store on top of your APIs, or you can store on top of any kind of asset we are supporting within Azure API Center. This could be APIs, it could be deployments, or it could be environments. So right now within here, I am customized 2 different metadata, and we are supporting lots of different data types. So you can see I'm even creating these based on different data types here. So what does it mean now that I have configured this custom metadata? So this is where we can check out our web API and see and find out more about it here as well. So if I click on my web API, I can see some very general built-in information about my web API here. I can also find out about my contact information because my developer specifies this in their Open API specification. We are detecting it and just attaching it to our API in here as well. And last but not least, here's where the concept of custom metadata comes in, and whatever use cases, whatever additional information you want to store on top of your APIs, here's a way for you to store this information. You can easily edit and modify it, and so keep your inventory on track, up to date for whatever information you want to store on top of it. All right, we talked about governance, right? So how do I know my API is actually following some of the rules that I have within my organization? So this is where API analysis comes in. And within this tab, you can see these APIs that I already had in API Center. Me as an API admin, perfect, no error, no warning messages. But okay, something is going on here. I have an error and I have a warning message. So let's check out the API analysis report. As you can see, so I went ahead and have specified some rules, some guidelines, how I want my Open API specification to look like. Right now, I just have one error and one warning message. If I scroll down here, I can even find some of the description that comes with either this error or this warning message. And it even shows me, okay, what's happening here. So it gives me some indication on what is going wrong here. Remember, I have the head of an API admin on. So rather than updating it here, I actually want to contact my API developer. So let's click on here. I want to define a message. I saw one arrow, one warning. Please fix. And I'm just going to hit the send messages. And this is just an example as a workflow, right? This could be an approval workflow, whatever kind of message you want to send out. And you saw as soon as I hit the send button, now somebody is being notified, maybe even the contact that I previously defined in my API as a contact information. So perfect. This workflow ran. You can see I'm even sharing the message that I wanted to specify. So me as a developer, I'm now wondering, well, okay, one error, one warning message. What are some of the guidelines we are talking about? So I actually added a reference documentation about these guidelines. So let me open this in here. I'm not sure if anybody of you are familiar with API linting engines, in particular Spectral. So this is actually what we are using under the hood to enable API analysis in API Center. This is a very simple YAML file. Currently, I implemented 2 different rules, one for a naming convention, one for an API version convention. We do support custom functions within API Center as well. So depending on where you are at in your API design governance journey, whatever use case you want to do, this is where you can use API Center to leverage our Spectral linting engine under the hood to show these error warning messages within API Center. All right, perfect. So now me as a developer, I know I'm going to copy this. Why am I going to copy this URL? This is where I'm going to go back to my Visual Studio Code extension. Well, ideally, I have done this or checked on these API design guidelines before even deploying, before even registering, right? But we know API developers, they don't always know about the rules. Maybe they forgot about it. So this could be a different step. Ideally, this has happened before, but we all understand things can happen. So rather than doing this never, I'm now just gonna go in here and via our Visual Studio Code extension, set an active API style guidelines. So I'm going to input the remote URL that was shared with me previously. I'm going to set the API guideline and style guidelines here. And you can see, okay, perfect. This was implemented. And I can see now the error on warning messages within my IDE. So ideally, I've actually checked on this before. So this time, everyone is using Copilot these days. So I'm actually going to go and run Copilot, which is also telling me about, well, what's the issue? Perfect, it detected it. Of course, check on it before you accept, but you can go ahead and even use the help of Copilot here to help you fix some of the issues that were detected. So while Copilot is still running and trying to help me here, I already went ahead and imagine now, we all love CI/CD, right? So I went ahead, I implemented all of these changes. Now I'm publishing the new version of my currently used web API. So imagine I implemented my CI/CD. So ideally, it's just at some point, as soon as I hit deploy or as soon as I'm pushing it to my GitHub repository, it will show up as a new version here in API Center. So I went ahead and already created this new version because this time I don't want to register a new API, right? I only want to register a new API version. So this one is showing up here. Perfect. So now me as a developer, I can mark this as complete, and this will then trigger another workflow and will tell my API admin, perfect, this has been updated, a new version was registered. So let's go back to my API Center experience, and let's put on the API admin hat one more time. So I'm not going to see a new API in here, right? Because we registered a new API version depending on the CI/CD pipeline or GitHub action item that I implemented. So this is what I can see now. But most importantly, what does the API analysis experience look like? So as soon as I go in here, okay, this is the version we previously had, but just to showcase you the new version or the new things that has been added, you can see now this time, based on all the changes that I made and I switched it up to, I'm not going to see any error warning messages, which is great. So now me as an API admin, I can expose these APIs securely because I made sure that my API guidelines are being represented here correctly. So I can now, with a good heart, let my developers use these, maybe even generate an API client. I know everyone is usually very curious. As I mentioned, we previously went GA with the product. So we launched GA in May 1 month ago. What are some of the things that we currently have on the roadmap? And in particular, look at the middle stream here. Most importantly, we are the small sister, the big sister is Azure API Management. So we really want to have a seamless experience between these different products. So that's what we are heavily investing next semester to make this experience as smooth as possible. Maybe even just link my API Center to one or more APIM instances. So ideally, all of the APIs show up. You can either do your API governance features that you want to do here, or you can then expose it via the Visual Studio Code extension so your internal teams can use and do some fun things here as well. What are some other things that we are currently investigating, looking at? API shadow discovery is something that has been brought to our attention as well. We're going to look at it from a GitHub project base. So that's something we are investigating or looking at for this semester, is what could be a good way to detect all of these shadow APIs that are out there because we talked about managed services, right? Managed services where you know I have APIs implemented, I have APIs deployed here, but what about all of the shadow APIs that you want to also see within your API center, and you also want to governance? Maybe you even want to expose it or bring into an API management instance here as well. We always have these different layers, so you're going to see us announcing more and more features in either the inventory, in the governance, or in the discovery and consumption layer. I'm super excited and interested as soon as you go and test the product to come back to us, share some of the thoughts, some of the feedback you have. And saying this right before I'm going to let you go for some drinks and networking. Get started today with Azure API Center. Feel free to connect, stop by. Please test the product itself as well. Share some feedback, and thanks everyone for listening.